Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Radical Democracy Show. I'm your host, Kamali Rose, and today I am joined by a very special guest. Back on the show again is with us this time, Dr. Tamanisha J, who has her Ph.D. in International Relations from Florida International University, where she studies Caribbean development and economic imperialism. And she's joining us today to discuss the assassination of the Haitian president and the ongoing struggle for liberation by the people of Haiti, and of course the role of U.S. and European empire in that country. So thank you so much for joining us today, Tamanisha. We really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for re-inviting me back.
Awesome. It's always awesome to have you. So let's get right to it. Earlier this week, the president of Haiti, Jovenel Moïse, was assassinated. For people that are unfamiliar with Haiti's history, recent and otherwise, what's a good starting point for us in order to understand who Jovenel Moïse is and what the conditions were that led up to his assassination?
Yes. So all of these things are really complicated topics, and it has a lengthy history involved, but just for a quick rundown. So Jovenel Moïse became the president of Haiti after he was chosen as Michel Martelly's, the former president's successor, for the next re-election, because Martelly's term was coming to an end and he would be unable to run again. And it should be noted here that Martelly actually became the president of Haiti because after the 2010 earthquake in 2011, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton actually flew into Haiti and told René Preval, who was the president before Martelly, that Martelly would become the next president of Haiti. And at the time, a lot of people thought it was really weird that a president would just give up power, especially to just a blatant disrespect of sovereignty and democracy. But since then, we know that Preval came out basically saying that he was threatened to have a coup against him if he didn't essentially cede power to the Martelly government. And so that already sort of paints the tradition that Jovenel Moïse is coming from. But prior to joining politics, he was a businessman. More recently, because his earlier businesses were not in the agricultural sector, but later on he did join in the agricultural sector, and it was through business connections that he actually made his political connections. And so in the agricultural sector, a lot of people try to paint Jovenel Moïse in the West as this humble banana farmer that, gained political prominence in Haiti, but he was actually a big banana farmer that displaced hundreds of Haitian peasant farmers. And in Haiti, small family farming is very important. And of course, all of this is happening in, a world where climate collapse, ecological erosion, and all of these things are just a reality. And so even though he was handpicked by Martelly, he ran on a platform of, he's going to fix the soil, address climate change, address sort of farmer grievances, everyday Haitian grievances. And I suspect that part of the reason why Martelly actually picked Jovenel Moïse to be his successor was because he was a businessman, not in politics already. And it was to sort of maybe gain some sort of goodwill amongst the Haitian people to say, this is a guy who's, from a humble background. He's a farmer just like you. But of course, we know that that is, skirting around the truth a bit. And so Jovenel Moïse, he came to power. As soon as he came into power, again, because the Martelly government was perceived as largely corrupt, as in they were rigging elections, and specifically rigging elections in his favor. And what we saw was that when Jovenel Moïse came to power, only 12% of the Haitian electorate voted. And while electoral turnout is usually low anyway, especially in states and in societies where people perceive their votes not mattering because whoever they select, there will be some sort of rigging or some sort of intervention that will lead to that person not gaining power. Jovenel Moïse's election was actually quite lower. So it wasn't in the 16, 17, 18, 19% range. It was actually in the 12% range. And that's, I think, rounding up a bit. And so that is sort of how he came to power. So he was already marred by sort of corruption. And then when he assumed the powers of the presidency, you had the Petrocaribe report, which came out that showed that he was part of an embezzlement scheme to embezzle funds from Haitians. I have seen that post his assassination, you have different people trying to paint him as this sort of leftist leader in Haiti or part of this leftist government. But of course, that is also not the case. Under his tenure, the Haitian army was revived, the Haitian police force is empowered, and also gangs within Haiti empowered because they get directions from politicians to sort of, you know, disrupt descendants or like opposition strongholds within Haiti. And so it's kind of sad knowing that just as recently as 2 weeks prior to his assassination, there was another attack on a community in Haiti by these sort of state policing forces, and people forgetting all of that completely in light of his assassination.
Wow. So, so Moïse, it sounds like somebody that gets, 12% of the vote, doesn't sound like he was a popular figure. That would, that gives the impression that, okay, well, here's this unpopular figure. He's been taken out. So the people of Haiti now must be, surely they must be happy about this. He was unpopular and now he's gotten rid of. What is the significance of his assassination for the everyday people of Haiti?
So I would actually say the circumstances surrounding the assassination is actually quite worrying. These weren't Haitian protesters or people fighting for Haitian democracy and sovereignty and to end foreign intervention and meddling in the country, taking out who they find as an unpopular dictator. This was a very strategic, well-paid and well-financed operation that assassinated a president in the middle of the night in his private residency where there are security guards and bodyguards. So any regular Haitian, it would be almost impossible for them to have access to him. In fact, I was woken up at like 8:37 a.m. on the day that he was assassinated, and I was shocked. And my first thought was, it couldn't have been any regular Haitian that did it, especially because prior to his assassination, he was arresting, disappearing, and sometimes killing people who he thought were plotting an assassination attempt against him. So I was just so confused as to how could it be possible that a head of state, super hard to reach, could just be assassinated. It also wasn't, a public assassination where an unpopular person is being like flogged by a mob in the public square, protesting against him. It was, again, super strategic in the middle of the night. So even I was shocked to hear that he was assassinated. And while I'm not going to sit here and, espouse a whole bunch of cute words about him, the assassination, it sort of brings about this a feeling of fear, like who could have done this? Why did they do it? And what does that mean moving forward? And so from the beginning, I thought that it would have had to been something political, because if it was a sort of US-led project to assassinate him, it didn't make sense in my mind, given that he was an ally to the Trump administration. He was an ally to the Biden administration as well. And so I saw it as sort of like something political, maybe people within the country from the bourgeoisie class vying for some sort of political power. Because we also have to remember that at the time of his assassination, he was ruling by decree. The parliament was suspended, a lot of the mayoral terms expired, and so you had what would undoubtedly be a lot of disenchanted people from more elite classes that were dissatisfied with how the internal politics of the country were being ran. That is not to say that an assassination in the US, the same hemisphere of the US, could happen without US knowledge. So it was also my belief that the US may have known about the assassination and just not cared, because of either political factions that would be as brazen enough to assassinate a sitting leader of a country. The US would support them either way. And so we did hear initial reports with the interim president, Claude Joseph, saying, oh, the PM that Moïse chose before he was assassinated is fine with me being the interim president until elections are held. And then we heard reports from that guy, Ariel Henry, actually saying, no, this is not the case. What are you talking about? And so that's already speaking to those political sort of internal conflicts that I would assume would be what would cause Moïse's assassination. And then from that, you've also heard reports came out saying that Claude Joseph actually asked the US to intervene in Haiti to help him control the situation that was happening there. So just all of these things. And initially, the US report said that they declined to go in and investigate. And now we have reports saying that they're going in. Of course, anytime the US says, oh, they're going to decline to investigate the assassination of a president within its hemisphere, that should also always be treated with skepticism, because we already know the history of the US and the CIA in Latin American and Caribbean countries specifically.
Yeah. So with the U.S., essentially saying they initially, and that would be, Joe Biden and the Biden administration initially said that they, as you said, there were requests from the now interim president, who, self-declared interim president Claude Joseph, and he requested that the U.S. Send troops to in the initial reports that I read in the New York Times, they said that they were requesting troops to protect the airports, ports, and gasoline reserves in Haiti, which to me is always if you had it was just her, we just had reports of U.S. Citizens being involved in the assassination, and this would be to me like if in America here, if two they like to fearmonger against Russia a lot, and if two Russian citizens were just arrested for assassinating the U.S. president, and then the U.S. requested troops from Russia to come in and guard our ports and oil reserves, I think that naturally people would see some something amiss there and something to question. And so in this case where the U.S. has declined an invitation like that, you're saying that essentially it's the idea is that the U.S. doesn't really care which of these two factions are taking power, because either the sort of the Claude Joseph being in power, or Ariel Henry, both of those factions you're saying would be friendly to U.S. interests, is essentially.
I think that both of those factions would be friendly to U.S. interests, but of course to differing degrees. Of course, the Claude Joseph faction would be friendlier if we are to also acknowledge that he did participate in sort of the 2004 coup developments that were happening in Haiti. He was a pro-coup, I don't know what you say, pro-couper in Haiti. And so, again, under that light, it's not surprising that it would also be him asking for the U.S. to come in. What is interesting about his invitation to the U.S. to sort of help close the ports and all of these things is that Jovenel Moïse actually had control over, again, the Haitian army that he actually revived, because the Haitian army was disbanded under Aristide. And so you have to remember that there were Haitian forces within Haiti that could have protected the ports and all of these things. And we also found out that some of the alleged assassins were also killed by the police in the early morning hours of that same day that the assassination occurred. So it just seems a bit odd or weird to then ask for U.S. help. I think that the invitation of the U.S. is more so to show these political factions who the U.S. would ultimately really support. And that is why I'm hesitant to say, oh, the assassination of Jovenel Moïse is any sort of liberatory project for Haitians who already saw his democracy as unpopular. Because what you will have are two, again, unpopular factions vying for power within Haiti. And so I think that the assassination, and even pre-assassination, you still have an environment where Haitians will still be fighting for their liberation. Haiti will still be fighting for its sovereignty. Haiti will still be fighting to have a sort of real democracy, because what you now have is an even worse buildup of the Haitian security state as aided by U.S. security forces now. And what does that mean for Haitian protesters that will be out there in the streets? Political sort of situations like this are not new within Haiti. They're usually followed by huge disregard for Haitian rights, huge amounts of repression against the Haitian people. And so while a lot of people are worrying about what this means for Haitian democracy, will these political factions be able to assert political stability? None of these articles saying, oh, send in US for stability, or recognize this person for stability, talks about what stability looks like for Haitian people. Because if we remember, the reason why Joe Biden and his administration claimed that they supported Jovenel Moïse remaining in power until 2022 was because he was bringing political stability to Haiti. What does that mean if he was also in charge of gang attacks on Haitian villages and communities? What does that mean that he was arresting Haitians unjustly, that he was arresting Supreme Court justices and rounding up journalists as well? What does the political stability mean? And so to me, what these people are basically saying is that we need more neocolonialism and more repression of Haitians so that friendly governments can remain in control. And so all we see, ever since Haiti asserted its right to freedom as the first Black republic in the Americas, are sort of these interventions which disregard Haitian freedom for, foreign political elite interests. And I don't think that that's anything liberatory for Haitians.
Now, leading up to this, you have written some articles, and one of them you mentioned how Jovenel Moïse was essentially, he had talked about his intention to alter parts of of Haiti's constitution, and in a way that would allow him to extend his authority in over Haiti. So, with his assassination, has that process been stopped in any significant way, or is it still possible for whoever comes into power to continue those actions of Jovenel Moïse and to essentially, these were my understanding is that these were put in place in around 1987 in order to try to prevent any sort of dictatorship from happening again in Haiti. With his assassination, is that sort of possibility out of the question, or is there still some chance that whoever comes into power still tries to continue what his project of trying to seize power? You also mentioned, by the way, that the Senate has essentially been gutted, and all the mayors were their terms expired in 2020. I think it was July 2020, and they have not. No mayors have been replaced. So, moving forward, what's the process for democracy look like, and is there still some chance that there is a sort of authoritarian takeover here?
Mm-hmm. So I actually think the question that you're asking is really interesting, especially since in light of his assassination, you have people reaching out saying, oh, you were being too harsh to Moïse. He was bad, but you have to recognize that he's only bad in a certain context. And so someone actually sent me that message, and they said, you're too critical of Moïse here. You should include the word potentially, because he said that he would not run for re-election. Moïse, he wanted to change the constitution because he believed that the powers of the presidency should be strengthened, and part of that included extending presidential terms. And so he has said over and over again that he would not run for re-election. But when a draft of his proposed changes to the constitution leaked, it actually, one, would give him the ability to run for re-election, and two, remain in power longer than what is currently stated in the Haitian constitution. And so if you are someone saying that you're not running for re-election, yet you're also the person with one of the biggest hands in rewriting the Haitian constitution, why would you make it possible for you to run for re-election again and also to remain in power longer? And so again, this just goes back to some people wanting you to completely shut off your critical thinking lens because this person was assassinated. So this is why I'm still stressing to people that Haitians were protesting Moïse prior to his assassination, and that this political faction war that we're seeing is also going to be something that Haitians would probably most likely still be protesting again. And so, again, the Haitian constitution was changed in 1987 to prevent a slide back to dictatorship because of the Duvalier dictatorship, which was again supported by Western countries. There you saw mass repression of Haitians, killings, rapes. They also said that communism and socialist ideologies were un-Haitian, and so you could actually be punished if you were a Haitian that spread pro-democracy ideals that again were slanted as communism and socialistic ideas. And so this actually has a long history, which is why Moïse and the protest signs that were happening against him were in English, saying he's trying to be a dictator. And not only is he trying to be a dictator, but foreign interests are actually supporting these acts when it is quite clear why the Haitian constitution was changed in the first place. And yeah, you have some Western states like Canada that apologize for supporting the Duvalier dictatorship, but where were they on Moïse? And so a lot of people don't necessarily ask these questions. And I just think that that's also something important to consider. In terms of the constitution change going through, I think that it still has a chance to go through with whoever becomes the next president if they decide to pursue it. And I only think this because, one, you have Martelly who has to pick a successor, Jovenel Moïse, because his term would be expired and he'd be unable to run again. And then that successor to be the one who then says, oh, we should make these changes to the Constitution. He could be making way for himself to do a potential run, even though he said that he wouldn't, or a way for the person who picked him to be the successor to make a comeback if they wanted to. And so I really think it's up to the air. And if I say affirmative yes or no, it would just be speculation on my part. And so whenever there are power grabs or like political parties that split into factions and they're vying for power, I say that, you know, almost anything is on the table in regards to what they would want that power grab to look like. And so right now would just be speculation on my part.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you wrote an article about how the leading up, and you mentioned, you know, leading up to these, to, you know, what in the events leading up to this assassination. And I say, I think that this is a bad habit of, you know, folks in, you know, a lot of US, you know, folks here in the US, myself included, is that with you know, international affairs, we oftentimes don't pay attention until there's some sort of like major crisis event. And it's usually something, you know, that can generally be used to, you know, paint a negative picture, or paint somebody who the US is opposed to in a negative light. But until we see these sort of major crises occur, we're not paying attention. I saw this happening in Palestine. You know, there are peaceful protests going on in Palestine by the Palestinian people all the time, and we don't cover that. And, you know, the U.S. media is guilty of that. They don't cover that. Mainstream media, with all their resources, you know, they're not covering those peaceful protests. But then as soon as things turn violent, then they are, you know, willing to cover that story. And so in the same way, you had written about the events that, you know, before this ever happened, you were talking about the situation on the ground in Haiti and the types of protests that were going on there. And so could you tell us a little bit about those protests and what the significance of some of the signage being used being in English during those protests is?
Yes. So my conversation piece was sort of re-upped to sort of come across as an obituary for Jovenel Moïse after his assassination. And as I was talking with my editor, we were talking about how these conversations then become sexy for other news publications to publish when a head of state is assassinated. I got so many emails and requests to do interviews and stuff. And I ultimately turned down a lot of them and said that these are Haitian people that you can reach out to that have been talking about this a lot. Even when I agreed to come on your show, I also told you these are also Haitian people that you can talk to about this who have been talking.
And I did reach out. I absolutely reached out.
A long time. And so I get really frustrated because we see this all the time, especially when it concerns the Caribbean, that no one cares about what is going on until something big happens. And it's not even as if in this moment, we're caring about what Haitians are fighting for and what Haitians are demanding. We're talking about Haiti because the leader of Haiti was assassinated. And in talking about his assassination, again, you see these fawning praises. One of the first things I noticed after his assassination were all of these pieces talking about the president of Haiti is assassinated, the president of Haiti is assassinated. Not one of them mentioned that he was ruling as a dictator, as seen by a large majority of Haitians. Not any of them mentioned that he was effectively ruling by decree and had dissolved the parliament. And so all of these things, I were just like, his assassination is being devoid of context. So he can then be referred to as like a martyr or some sort of stable leader that was good for Haiti, just trying to build Haiti up. And then all of a sudden he's assassinated by these outside mercenaries. And it was, again, like a continual erasure and ignoring sort of the Haitian plight, fighting against foreign imperialism, intervention, and breaches on their sovereignty within their country. And so, again, Haitians have been protesting Moïse the entire time he has been president. I think that earlier this year, you had some people starting to pay attention because you had hashtags like Free Haiti trending. And those hashtags were trending in a way that people in English-speaking audiences could understand. And that was what my piece was about. You had people that were burning the American flag, carrying upside down crosses with the American flag, Canadian flag, and French flag on them. And then you had minor protest signs saying Jovenel is a dictator and US support, just end foreign meddling. And I think that the importance of, and I wrote this, of those signs being in English and of the hashtag spreading in English was to draw attention to Western audiences to interference that happens in Haiti all the time to the detriment of Haitians. And that we as Western audiences should be extending solidarity to Haitians, demanding that our foreign governments stay out of their country, stop selecting their leaders for them, and ultimately stop supporting leaders that frequently massacre, kill, and unjustly arrest Haitians. And so, again, now solidarity prayers are extended to Haiti, but it's not going towards Haitians. It's going towards the guy ruling Haiti that was just assassinated. And so even again, we see the wants of Haitians put on the back burner to this sexy topic of a political assassination. But no one is talking about what was leading up to the assassination and what this assassination means for Haitians. It is not, oh, Haitian liberation is now here. It is two political factions who are going to be equally as ruthless to Haitians in Haiti. And I think that we need to remember this and consistently talk about who we are talking about and who we are extending solidarity to in these conversations.
Yeah. In that regard, is there a path forward for sort of, there's this struggle for liberation of the Haitian people, and it doesn't sound to me like this next upcoming election is going to, one way or the other, move things in a direction that necessarily empowers the everyday people of Haiti and improves the condition of Haiti in any substantive way. What does the path forward look like for the Haitian people? Is there some path to liberation for them? What are they going to have? What is going to have to take place in order for that to happen? And something that we talked about in our last conversation was the sort of, the talk of defunding the U.S. military and how we talk about what those funds need to be diverted to. Given the U.S. involvement in all of the destabilization and destruction in that country, does the U.S. not have a reparations to essentially pay, the role of essentially, economic repairment of some sort? Or is it just a matter of staying the hell out of it completely? Is that the best that we can do at this point?
Mm-hmm. And this, I'm also going to bring up something from our last conversation as well. And This is me mentioning the West, because anytime I hear reparations for Haiti and Haitians, the first country that pops up in my mind is France. Yeah. It is ridiculous that Haiti had to pay France billions of dollars essentially to be a participant in the international political economy because they dare to no longer be enslaved. Yes. And so whenever we talk about Haiti, we have to remember that it's not just U.S. interests that are predominant in Haiti, but you also have French interests and Canadian interests that are also predominant. In fact, when the coup in Haiti happened in 2004, it wasn't U.S. troops that went to Haiti first to ensure, that everything was going smoothly. It was Canadian troops that went in to actually make way for U.S. troops to come into Haiti. And so when we talk about,
I didn't even know that Canada had troops. If I'm all the way real, like whoever hears about the Canadian military, like we never talk about the Canadian military. I seriously, it's just thought it like part of NATO or something like that. Like that's incredible. Like I never knew that. Yeah.
I actually wrote a small piece about Canadian troops and their involvement in the Caribbean. So you have them setting up like little military outposts, and they say, oh, this is to help these states with natural preparedness, but they actually haven't helped any states with natural preparedness. They're just there, and usually to help sort of facilitate these sort of interventionist tendencies within the region. And just a couple of weeks back, I retweeted something from someone who this year started questioning, what are Canadian troops doing in the Caribbean and in these other Asian countries? And I was like, yes, we need reports like this, because Canada's military involvement around the world, and especially in global South countries, is typically ignored. But Canadian involvement in Haiti, as well as French involvement in Haiti, is just as gruesome as the U.S. And so when we think about reparations towards Haiti, there are a lot of states that owe Haiti reparations. And when we talk about what liberation looks like for Haitians, I always say we need to be, one, again, asking Haitians that, and two, just also listening. If they're saying no more foreign intervention, then I would quite frankly say, yes, we do need to get out and just leave it. Let them determine what liberation looks like for themselves. But of course, I'm also not, I guess, idealistic enough to believe that countries like the US or Canada or France would ever leave Haiti alone because of the overwhelming interest that these states have in regards to finance capital, in regards to manufacturing, where they purposely keep Haitian wages low so that they can develop their products. And so it's really hard to think about what liberation for Haiti looks like, especially under a capitalistic system where imperialism in the global South is sort of the, I guess, would you say, like the fire of the engine to that system.
Yeah. Wow. So, and yes, and I'm, you, like we talked about last time, I'm certainly guilty of that and constantly like having this framing around, the US, but I think it's one of the most outrageous things whenever I talk about, reparations, I try to, bring up the, this idea of like the, what happened with France and that being such a just egregious injustice that a people that were, liberated themselves would then, turn around and be forced to pay their oppressors, their former oppressors, essentially for not allowing them to rule over them and to brutalize them any longer. And so that is something that I think is by and large, I think that information is kept out of our sort of, frame of reference and knowledge in this country, because it's inspirational if you look at the idea of what the Haitian people, just them gaining their freedom in the first place and being the only successful essentially slave revolt that led to their freedom, and we don't even have that as a reference, and so we don't know this history of France's role. Now, the connection between Canada and Haiti, is that somehow tied to the fact that Canada is has its own roots of French imperialism? Does that tie them together in a way that Canada is often linked to? Does Canada end up supporting France in a lot of their sort of empire, or is that just unrelated?
So I wouldn't necessarily be able to be specific about French-Canadian involvement in Haiti as a precursor to that, but I wouldn't be shocked if the initial connection started off from a sort of French imperialism in Haiti. What I will say is that too often many people only see Canada as, partnering to these other bigger imperial states, but as my dissertation shows, that is not always the case. Canada pursues its own interests, and oftentimes its interest happens to align with countries like the US or France, because there are moments where Canadian interests actually contest the wants of those two countries. And so where it does align, it's in, again, upholding sort of exploitation of Haitians. And so it could be seen as partnering or allying with them in that sense. But we have to also recognize that their goals are fundamentally the same. They are exploiting global South peoples, their countries, etc., for their own benefits. And so I wouldn't say like, oh, they're just allying. I would say that they're just as forceful in sort of how they want to punish and exploit the Haitian people as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's so important, because I certainly do it, and I think that we have this, it's often looked at as, with Canada, that they're just sort of tagging along with the U.S. or with these other sort of imperial forces, and they are just sort of the nice friendly neighbor up north there, but to put it in that sort of to put that frame around it, it does show that they are their own, powerful state, and they have their own interests that they are looking to serve. And where those happen to align with the U.S. or countries like France, then they will sort of work in conjunction in these areas. But we do have to, take note of Canada's own role in this and how that plays out. And so there's sort of it feels like there's these three forces. There's also the OAS is also seemingly a part of this, and I imagine NATO is also involved in some ways. What is OAS? And I honestly have a lot of ignorance around that. Like, what is OAS, and how do they sort of impact this situation here, if they do at all? I've just seen their name floated around a few times now.
So for people who may be watching that wouldn't know what the OAS means or stand for, the OAS is the Organization of American States, and it's purportedly a body of states in the Americas, working for a better, Western hemisphere, so to say. But as with almost all international bodies or foreign bodies, those states with overwhelming power, influence, and money within the organization sort of rule it. To give you an example of this, when Donald Trump was the president of the United States, and Jovenel Moïse, he recognized Juan Guaido as president, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Donald Trump actually supported Moïse holding elections sooner rather than later, because he believed that if Moïse didn't, we would continue to see more Haitians immigrating into the U.S. And so his stance was to stop Haitians from coming to the U.S., Moïse needs to hold the elections. And interestingly enough, that was also the OAS stance on whether or not Moïse would hold elections, as well as the UN stance on whether or not Moïse would hold elections. And I should also note, I'm not talking about the UN general body, just like the UN director. When Trump lost the election and Joe Biden assumed the presidency in 2021, and Joe Biden said, no, actually, Jovenel Moïse is correct and his term wouldn't end until 2022. Surprise, surprise, that became the OAS's stance, as well as the UN stance. And so when we think about the US or the OAS, I like to say that the OAS is a US-friendly regional body that, so basically supports everything that the US does in the hemisphere. And so in that vein, I actually do not view the Organization of American States as a sort of legitimate source for news or information that wouldn't have a pro-US bias or pro-US propaganda tilt. And so even when I write, I don't include the OAS as a sort of official source in my writing. But for people who are, interested in what the OAS is, it is the Organization of American States that are purportedly trying to, allow states within the hemisphere to talk, work out issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Gotcha.
Yeah. So you had sort of mentioned that the state of current state of affairs for people right now. There's the interim president Claude Joseph. He instituted something called a state of siege. And what is that looking like right now for the people that are just sort of families that are on the ground in Haiti? In what is how is that expected to continue and yeah, just what does that mean? What is the state of siege and how does that affect the people that are on the ground there?
So a state of siege was issued earlier on, like on the day of the assassination, and I am unsure about this, but I believe that it was like the airports and stuff became opened maybe a day or two afterwards, because they had allegedly caught all of the assassins, killed the ones that they couldn't catch, and maybe there are a few more that they haven't caught yet. But a state of siege, so there's two ways to think about it. If you think about French, a state of siege could be like, oh, this just is just a simple state of emergency, or in the English variant, a state of siege is step above declaring like a state of war within a country or whatever. But what both of these do is they allow state forces, military and policing forces, to basically arrest people that they find suspicious without any sort of formal charges or anything. It's just a way to round people up and let them investigate what happens, or to hold them indefinitely. And so when a state of siege was declared, one, that was very concerning, especially considering the fact that I don't remember exactly who he is, but someone in Haiti from an official government source actually tweeted out that they had caught some of the people involved with the assassination of Jovenel Moïse. And so in my mind, if you've caught some people, why are you then also declaring a state of siege? And again, to me, that was probably to curb some of the Haitian protests. You did have some people in Haiti that were also trying to find these people who assassinated Jovenel Moïse, because even if they may not have liked Moïse, again, his assassination was still a shocking event. But what it does is it instills a state of fear in people. And also when the state of siege was declared, you still had sort of military and police forces exchanging fire with sort of the alleged assassins in the country as well. And so many people were afraid to leave their houses because they could hear the sounds of gunfire. And it was just like rapid, and it seemed ongoing for hours. And so with the state of siege, you sort of embolden the powers of the state policing and military forces to, again, carry on their operations, but without the formalities that would come with being arrested and then hearing what you're being charged or arrested for.
Gotcha. Yeah. So sort of like what we're able to do in with suspending habeas corpus and, like a sort of like a state of almost like martial law.
A state of anarchy kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Historically, the U.S. has done things like, go in and, we took over, we took over in 1915, like for like a couple of decades, we took over, sent military in and took actions like that. With the U.S. saying that they're staying out, but then sending in folks from the FBI and the DHS to Haiti, does that, what should that signal to us? What is the extent of U.S. involvement at this point? And also, are there any other sort of factors here into determining like will elections be held in September? There were elections that were supposed to be held in September. Will those elections still happen? And if only 16% of the people are voting, even in the times where there's more election participation, it sounds like it's almost, there is no answer, there's no no hope for it, but in what way, how do the Haitian people, how do they get towards and move towards democracy in any way, moving forward from here?
Okay, so anything I'll mention now will be speculation on my part, and I will try to 100% remember all of the questions that I was just asked. And so in the US saying that, oh, they're not going to go, but now sending DHS and the CIA there to investigate what happened, I speculate that it's because they'd want to maybe not have it so that any investigation into the assassination comes back to a specific political faction, pro-US faction in Haiti that may have carried out the assassination. Something that I found weird initially when the initial reports were coming out were how they were able to capture some of the alleged assassins alive and others not alive. And then once we found out that these assassins were mercenaries, in my mind, it was like, oh, I don't know too much about mercenaries, but from what I've read, it's that not that many of them, like they'll have the mission from, a mercenary source that tells them this is what we're going in to do. And then that mercenary source is the one who's dividing up the money between all of them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my first thought were all of the ones killed the ones that got the information that was real? And then the other ones who were not killed, who were spared, are the ones who don't really know what's going on. And something else that sort of fueled, I don't even know, that speculation within me is that the assassins, that were the alleged assassins that were caught said, oh, we were just going there to arrest him and not kill him. And if you're going to arrest someone and not kill them, and they're in their bed sleeping in their private residence, you wouldn't need to shoot them 12 times. You wouldn't need to break any bones or do any other things to the body. And so it's like, who are the mercenaries that they caught? And are those mercenaries the ones that actually knew anything? And some people say like, oh, because this mercenary is from the US or this mercenary is from Colombia, this was a plot from the US government or the Colombian government, who are in cahoots with each other anyway. But when you think about mercenaries, a mercenary can come from anywhere. It's just someone has to be able to hire them. And presumably the person that is hiring them, and if I'm remembering correctly, it was like there were 26 alleged assassins. That takes a lot of money. And so I think that any sort of investigation that happens would try to be one that sort of crafts the official story on what happens. And then maybe much later, many years later, we'll figure out, oh, but this was what really happened, so to speak. And so that's one side of it. I believe that the US initially saying no, that they wouldn't be involved, is because, again, the factions that are, seeking to do a power grab or are disagreeing are US friendly factions. Yep. And now them going in is to basically decide well, who do we support more and why?
Yeah.
And not necessarily, oh, we really want to find out what happened. And I also think that it was strange initially when they said no, because if you have an ally, a presidential ally of yours that passes, and you don't have anything to do with it at all, and you didn't have any intel that it was going to happen at all, why would you not go in to support an investigation into what actually happened? And so it's always been my belief that whatever is revealed to us or whatever comes out will be what is crafted and not necessarily what 100% happened. Moving on to sort of the elections and whether or not they'll happen in September, I honestly don't know. I would be surprised if elections didn't happen, because it is the case that a president was assassinated. And so maybe it will be the case that the factions that have split run different candidates, and then we see what the results of that election will be. It will be interesting to see if Claude Joseph himself is on any of the ballots, and if Ariel Henry are on any of the ballots and they're competing against each other. Because I don't know if you know this, but the initial reports that came out, Claude Joseph was actually saying, oh no, I've spoken to Ariel Henry and he's fine with me being the interim president until these September elections come. And then Ariel Henry comes out and says there's just confusion, he doesn't know what's happening, et cetera, et cetera. So you did have those conflicting insights earlier on. But I think that the smart move, so to speak, would be to hold elections in September. And again, with U.S. security forces in the country and already on higher alert policing apparatus within the country as well, I don't know if that would necessarily persuade more people to, go to the polls or get out to vote within Haiti. And I don't know if election turnout will be higher or not. I initially would suspect it would be if Moïse were to hold elections and had not been assassinated, because you did have a very vocal opposition saying your term is up. Like, you're ruling by decree because your term is up. And so while the focus is on the two political factions that are, breaking up and having these disputes with each other, it'd be interesting to see what the opposition that was always existing under Moïse, what the opposition actually does in preparation for or prior to the September elections, if they are to be had. And so there are many different sides to this piece that we have to consider. We can't leave any of them out. In regards to, again, Haitian democracy, and what is that going to look like? I think.
And to me, let me just say, when I say democracy, I don't mean in the sort of superficial neoliberal sense of when do they get to go and cast a vote for these self-select leaders? What does it really look like for, is there a serious path forward to them? Is it going to take violent struggle? Is it going to be do they need revolutionary sort of struggle in order to actually get the will of the people enacted? And what is it that the people there on the ground by and large want? And obviously that's a very hard question to answer, but my guess is some means of actual true self-determination. And how is there any hope of them moving towards that? And then maybe you can say about if there's anything that we can do around the world to the sort of everyday people to be in solidarity with those people, with the actual people of Haiti.
So I just want to note that international solidarity is actually very important, and I've been thinking about this a lot. And in my mind, it's not fully framed, but maybe if I talk about it here and then I start thinking about it later on when I go to, when I'm just thinking, I'll have a better response. But in the Caribbean region, or what we now call the Caribbean region, the first Caribbean revolution was the Haitian Revolution. And I'm not talking about the different other slave revolts that would happen in colonies of people trying to fight off their oppression, but I'm talking about the first revolution in the sense where they were able to kick the oppressors out of the country and determine that this was their state by and for Haitians, and that all people were free. And so not only was Haiti the first free Black republic in the Americas, but Haiti was the first free republic, period. Because when the Haitian Revolution happened, yes, the US, they had the American Revolution against Britain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but they were still slave holding. The US was still a slave holding society. Haiti was the first revolution in the Americas that guaranteed freedoms to all people, and that was the first one to assert itself as a Black republic. when we look at the other revolutions that happened, whether it be in Cuba or Grenada, sorry. Okay, I have a sneeze and
Yeah. Let it go.
Whether it happened in any of those two other countries, international solidarity was very important. So there would not have been a Cuban revolution if the USSR did not exist to help support that revolution. And even under Maurice Bishop as well, when sort of the US didn't want to extend funds to them because they didn't like that the revolution happened there, he relied on allies in Palestine and also in the USSR and in Cuba, etc. And so one of my biggest gripes with the US left is that there isn't sort of a real anti-imperialist movement. Like people say, oh, the analysis is usually very much like, oh, the US shouldn't be involved. And again, it's only when intervention is concerned. But what does actual international solidarity look like? Like earlier on in the conversation, we were speaking about things like reparations and states giving other states reparations. But as US citizens with access to US dollars, and I always tell people this, if you make friends in other Caribbean countries who are trying to do different things in order to bring capital into their states so that they could have more local thriving schools, businesses, and education centers that aren't just feeding them state propaganda that is Western friendly, they could do so much more with that. And so when we think about international solidarity, it's not just, oh, our states need to keep out. We have to recognize how our states are economically exploiting other countries and what we could do to help curb that economic exploitation as well. And so revolutions in the Caribbean have not been possible, again, with the exception of the Haitian Revolution that was the first, without this sort of mass international solidarity. And we have to remember that when the Haitian Revolution happened, even though the US, again, it was a slaveholding society, was pretending, oh, revolution is good, they were hesitant to say revolutions like the Haitian Revolution is good, because then what would that say about them as a slaveholding society? And what would it say about them supporting sort of a Black republic over Anglo-French, whatever? So they all lent support to sort of reoccupy and re-enslave Haiti that ultimately failed. And so we have to keep things like this in mind. And it's not just international solidarity and we have to be anti-interventionist, but we have to be fighting the economic exploitation that happens in these countries by our countries. And so, and I said all of this to say that there is no, so Haitians can protest every single day, but if international solidarity against intervention in their country isn't had, if international solidarity that extends sort of economic help to these countries, recognizing that they've been exploited by Western countries, isn't had, any revolution would, one, fall flat on its feet, and two, not be able to start off. Like the people of Haiti have, again, they've been protesting for decades against neoliberalism, against Western intervention, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is still the case. And it's because sort of they've been lacking international solidarity that is, you know, dearly needed, that they haven't been getting, because again, we always miss out on the message that the Haitian protesters are saying. We're only focusing on it when it is sexy, but we're not necessarily extending solidarity. Solidarity doesn't start and end at anti-interventionism.
That's great. So maybe then, you know, we're getting to the end of, you know, the time that we have here, and I don't want to keep you longer than necessary. So maybe we can have you back on soon then to discuss that, because that's what I'm really interested in, because I just feel like, I don't know, I've become a bit demoralized with the online left, and sort of the discourse in the online left has seemed to focus more on what I would expect from, you know, corporate media, quite honestly, in just sort of, I heard, you know, a recent investigative journalist from Status Quo, Jordan Sheridan, called it the TMZ-ification of the online left media, where there's way too much time and oxygen being taken up for discussions of essentially what amounts to Twitter drama between different personalities in the media. And I've seen this a lot, and it's what, if you just look at the sort of content and the view count on out of different online left media entities on their videos when they're talking about something just sort of US Twitter drama versus all of these real world crises that are going on, water crises all around, the world, is, particularly.
And can I just interject here and say
yes.
one thing? This is part of the reason why I don't mind coming on your show. Like, your show actually talks and, brings on people who can talk about different histories in different countries, etc. And another show that did the same thing that I also watch and used to watch and also went on one time was the Michael Brooks Show. And it's because they looked at different countries and they actually spoke about these histories, not only that when they were sexy and something big happened, but because these histories matter and building international solidarity actually matters.
Yeah, no, I will say the Michael Brooks Show literally taught me about the history of Jamaica, and I lived in Jamaica for like 4 years of my life. In my formative years, I went to high school there, and I didn't know these basic things about the politics and the U.S. in the sort of U.S. European imperial involvement in the country that I had spent these really my father lives there. I have siblings that have lived there. My family stretches back from being slave brought as slaves to the Caribbean, and so it's the Michael Brooks Show. Those I'm spacing on what he used to call them, but the illicit histories. He did these illicit history episodes where he would talk about this, and it's just I would love to, if I to be able to do things like that and to do these deep dives. And honestly, I had talked about having you on the show to talk about Haiti, and I said it to my producer and stuff and my partner, that how disappointed I was in myself that I hadn't had you on earlier to talk about these issues, because you were talking about the situation on the ground in Haiti before all this happened and before this like big crisis happens. And I don't want to be one of those people that's always sort of reacting to these crises. We have to start to, on the left, get serious about things like if we talk about international solidarity, but it's just always feels to me like much of it is too much lip service and not thinking about how are we actually going to take actions that can move us forward in that way. And so I would love to have you back on truly soon, to talk about what that needs to start to look like, and maybe talk about some specific organizations. Maybe we can dive into some specific organizations, or ways that we can support specifically folks in Haiti, but then also in the Caribbean and around the world, and what that might look like. Mutual aid efforts. I've started to look into things like mutual aid efforts and things like that, and maybe there's some ways that we can extend mutual aid out internationally instead of just doing it locally in communities. And so I would really love to have you back on again soon, not in this context of like some big salacious these violent sort of major crises, but to talk about the sort of everyday violence that goes on against the everyday people of all of these countries. And I consider every one of these people just as important as and as an American citizen. We just have to start to recognize the humanity of these people all around the world, even if it happens to be in a small country like Haiti. It's still very significant, and these people deserve the same liberation and freedom that every other human being deserves. So thank you so much. Your work is incredible on this. I urge people every time, like you have to follow Tamanisha's work. Check out all, we have links to in the description below to all of her recent articles. I saw you published another article, I think just Friday, talking about Jovenel Moïse. But also, you've done a lot of work in this regard on the protests in Haiti and their struggle for liberation. And I think that it's important that we all be knowledgeable about this, and that we can start to think about how to actually do whatever work is necessary to improve this. So just thank you for all the work that you do and your courage in talking about these issues, even though they may not be the things that gain you the most popularity or get you a job on CNN or MSNBC. But you do great work, and I really urge people to follow you on Twitter. I believe the handle is at Tamanisha J John. I'm pretty sure we got linked to that in the description box below as well. But then also to check out your work in your writing, because it's really informative and has helped me to gain a much clearer understanding. Also, you recommended to me one other person on Twitter. Her name on Twitter is Madame Buchan. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but it's at M as in Michael, ADAN as in Nancy, BOUKHAN, and please check her out and follow her on Twitter as well, because we need to start to look to sources that are actually involved directly for information as well. Because what she's talking about, I haven't seen any mainstream media entities talking about this. The CIA connection of Claude Joseph, I haven't seen that reported anywhere. And so thank you for all that you're doing really in this space. And I really do hope to have you back on again soon to talk about some of these issues. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me on. All right. Thanks. See you soon. All right, everyone. Well, that was Dr. Tamanisha John, Ph.D. in International Affairs from Florida International University, specifically covers the Caribbean and economic imperialism in that region and around the world. And so please check out her work and follow her. And we got a lot of work to do here in the left, particularly in online left spaces. We just need to start to focus on the issues that matter, and because these crises, they're ongoing, they're happening all the time, and we have to we can't. There's too much time is being spent in online left media on shit that just doesn't matter, if I'm being all the way real, like that's my honest and real feelings. And it's been really frustrating recently to see some of, what so much of the coverage is focused on, when you have such important things happening, and there's only, it's these moments in time that we have, and we have to grab onto them and do everything that we can do to support these folks, and to support folks like Tamanisha John, who are doing this really, really critical, crucial work. So, we'll have her on as much as she's willing to come on, to be honest. And it's been part of the reason why you haven't seen, I've been dealing with some health issues as well, and part of the reason why you haven't seen me on a lot recently. But also, it's been really, I've just been truly demoralized by some of the content that I see coming out in online left media, and really needed a sort of a reset. And so we're getting back into it now. And I want to give a shout out and a thank you to all of our Patreon supporters, everyone that supports us on Coffee and Patreon. Coffee's our favorite, because they just take the least from creators. That's ko-fi.com/radical democracy. You can also find us on Patreon at patreon.com/radical democracy. But we really need to figure out how to and I want to give a shout out to Independent Left News for contributing $5 a month on Coffee and setting up our Discord server. Just a big shout out to Independent News. And then also a shout out to some of our newer Patreon members as well. Thank you so much to our newer supporters. We have Melody B, The Virtual Jonathan, and Artemis LA for each supporting us on Patreon. We deeply, deeply appreciate that. Even for as low as $1 a month, your support is critical. It's literally, it's the only thing that's going to allow us to eventually be able to, to do this more, to do this full time, because, you got to pay the bills, got to keep the lights on. And so, and a massive, massive shout out to Aditya for supporting us for $20 a month on Patreon. That's just, words can't describe how grateful we are for such a, that's a massive contribution for us. So thank you so much. We cannot thank you enough for that. And so, if we have any, I want to say what's up to What Up America and 100 Mac Jones. What Up America contributed our theme song as well, which we didn't play today just because we were, we're short on time and wanted to use, wanted to be respectful of Tamanisha's time. Congrats to her on her PhD. She's, last time we had her on, she was a PhD candidate. She is now Dr. Tamanisha John, and she commented and said, "Thank you so much for having me on," and says that she'll try to read the comments. So if you have anything else that you want to say to her, please feel free to leave comments. And 100 Mac Jones says that they love Tamanisha John's work and opinions. I agree. I wholeheartedly agree. I think that her work is exceptional, and I recommend, and I will continue to recommend to other leftist podcasts and hosts with bigger platforms than my own to have her on and to to get her her perspective on. And then, like she said, because she's doing this important work, and she says we have to make the effort to also bring in those voices. We're talking about Haiti. We should have on a Haitian, somebody preferably living in Haiti, but at least a Haitian person to talk about this that is knowledgeable about the topic and can talk about it from a left perspective, of course. So what up, America? Shout out to you, and great to see you again too. Sorry that we haven't done a lot of live episodes recently. Again, just been fighting back some migraines for myself that have been truly debilitating, and for weeks I've been battling these really terrible migraines, and so just been on a bit of a hiatus. We are hoping to get back into more frequent content now, but we really are just sort of at a crisis of identity here, where we want to make sure that we're focusing on important work, but it can sometimes be discouraging because the algorithm is, it shows us when you talk about issues, people aren't, for whatever reason, people aren't clicking on those topics, and the online left just isn't paying close enough attention to these things that matter. And we really got to do better in the audience as well, because I'm somebody that consumes a lot of online left media in the audience as well, is making sure that we are doing our part by watching that content, reading those stories, following these these voices and these folks that are doing really important, really critical work and talking about these issues and adding their insight in a way that you're not going to find anywhere else. Tamanisha has a very unique way of analyzing these issues and breaking them down, and it's we're lucky to have someone like her come on and help us to better understand these issues. And so we have to do the work as well in the audiences to make sure that we're sharing that content, spreading the word, and patronizing those people that are talking about real issues. And so there are folks like Status Quo doing great work in investigative journalism, and their content just doesn't get the same kind of viewership that something about, again, the latest Twitter drama does. And we can't allow that. There are people suffering in Haiti right now that we could be supporting through mutual aid efforts and otherwise. I would bet, and we need to start thinking about what mutual aid efforts can look like in an international context, I think. And so I would really love to have Tamanisha back on again soon, and some other folks that I have listed to reach out to specifically that are involved in mutual aid efforts, and maybe we can get a conversation going about what international mutual aid exists and how that might look moving forward, because this idea of like getting reparations from France and United States. I mean, look at what France did to the Haitian people. They forced them to pay them back, and US and other Western imperialist forces were involved in that decision. And then, so with that being said, like, in the US, not even willing to, they're not going to pay out, they're not willing to pay out reparations to their own people. Let's not wait around for that. Like, we can't wait around for some state to come and save us or the people suffering all around the world. We got to start to take it into our own hands and do it ourselves. And because these politicians, they're not doing it, it's not going to come from a politician. It really is going to come from the ground, from the grassroots on up. And that means that it's us. We can't. It's sort of this like what's that effect? When you like the bystander effect. When there's like some violent thing happening to someone, right in front of you, and there's a lot of people standing together. Nobody reacts, nobody helps this person in need. If somebody's being assaulted or mugged or something on the subway, and nobody intervenes. But if there's one person standing there, they find that people look around, they're like, well, nobody else is going to intervene, so I got to do something. We can't get our own sort of internet, sort of mass scale bystander effect where we keep thinking somebody else is going to do the work and somebody else is going to take the actions necessary to start to make this stuff happen. So that's what this show was really about. That was a wild compliment to, like, it wasn't, I'm sure she didn't necessarily intend it as a compliment, but I'll take it as a compliment that she compared us to the Michael Brooks show and saying that That's really, if you watch the first live episode we ever did, it was on the day that Michael Brooks passed. And that's what shocked me into action, really, to do the show. It was because I saw a void that was going to need to be filled in the wake of Michael Brooks passing. And I honestly haven't necessarily seen that void filled. I think that folks like Brianna Joy Gray are trying to fill that void with the Bad Faith podcast. And she's, I think I also follow someone, Bad Empanada, I think is a good one. I think the Fred Hampton leftists are doing a lot of solid work over there in a lot of their programs, Revolutionary Jargon with RJ, JB Fonts, the JB show, their main show with Nick. So there's some leftist organizations that are doing some good work, and a lot of the folks that I just named are Black leftists, other than Bad Empanada, and so there's places, there's sources that you can get this information from, and we gotta do our work to make sure that those are the folks in Status Quo with Jordan Sheridan. Like, we got to make sure that those folks, that their content is being viewed more, shared more, subscribed to, supported in every way that we can, because media plays a crucial role in all of this, and just being able to inform the people and also, to spread knowledge. That's what we're supposed to be about and supposed to be doing. So I would, I really need to, I want this show to really have some echoes of the Michael Brooks show, because that's what really got us started. And in order to do so, we need funding. Funding is going to be an important part of it. That's absolutely crucial to it. But we'll also start to do the work of thinking. We're trying to reimagine the show, honestly, and covering the news every single day. It can get you a certain kind of growth, but I want to make sure that we're not always just sort of like doing conjecture and always reacting to stories, but also thinking about and moving the conversation forward and keeping the focus not so US centric, right? Because that's also an important part of this, and something that I think is missing in online left discussions. There was, an attempt at a fascist coup in Peru that just got completely brushed over by the online left. I mean, pretty much nobody covered it, and so we have to do better. And I know that I want to be a part of it, but it has been very discouraging recently watching online left, and it's almost to the point of feeling like more must be done. That's what the feeling that comes out of it. And so I want to start to do more in that regard and bring on the guests that are able to support that. So please, keep an eye out. You're going to see more content coming from us now. We've been on a little bit of a lull for the past couple of months, but check out Tamanisha's past interview that we did on right after the the last violent crisis in Palestine, and then we had her on. So we'll try to bring on guests like Tamanisha, and hopefully Tamanisha herself, more often, and not in a reactionary sense, but we need to start to go on the offensive instead of being on the defensive with these sort of solidarity efforts. So Emoji donated $5 through Super Chat and says, keep it up. Thank you so much, Emoji. We deeply appreciate that, and we absolutely will keep it up. So thank you. We really appreciate that. And again, just a shout out to everyone who supports us. We really do need the support, and we absolutely appreciate it. And we'll try to, we understand what one of those dollars means to people nowadays. Everyone's struggling, and 78% of people, right, in this richest country in the world are living paycheck. 78% of workers living paycheck to paycheck. 50% of the country is a $500 emergency away from having to file bankruptcy or sell off some of their belongings in order to cover it. So people are struggling, and we understand what even $1 means to everyone. So in even what your time means, it's time is valuable. So what your time and your energy and effort means, and so we want to be channeling that into productive, positive, elements of change. And so we will continue to try to do that work. We'll cut a clip of the full interview and release just the full interview with Tamanisha. So you can share this out, but we'll do a nice edited version where it'll just be the full interview only. And then we'll also, I'll break up some clips and break out some clips on that as well. So, all right. Do we have any other comments that we have to get to? I think that we are, I think that wraps us up for today. Thank you again to our, we said that. Okay. So, all right. like, share, subscribe. You know the drill. Thank you to everyone for joining and watching today. And thank you again to Dr. Tamanisha J. John for her just incredible insight. And you know, we just appreciate her being on. And so thank you. Thank you so much. We will see you again soon, folks.